expanse of Wrangel Island, one woman's extraordinary tale of survival stands as the perfect example of human resilience and ingenuity. Stranded in one of the harshest environments on Earth, she faced relentless challenges with courage and resourcefulness. Her story, marked by isolation and perseverance, raises a fascinating question. How did she manage to protect herself from the freezing landscape and formidable polar bears? Well, today we're delving into the story of Ada Blackjack. She was left alone in the Arctic with polar bears, and 2 years later, they returned and found something extraordinary. There's a lot to unpack, so let's take a look at it from the very beginning. Early life and background. Ada Blackjack, whose maiden name was Ada de Lutuk, was born on May 10th of either 1898 or 1899 in the remote settlement of Spruce Creek, a mere 8 miles from Solomon, Alaska. She belonged to the Inupiat people, an indigenous group native to the Arctic regions of Alaska. Historically, her people relied on hunting and fishing to survive in the harsh conditions of the Arctic. Their diet consisted largely of marine mammals like seals, walruses, and whales, as well as caribou, fish, and berries during the summer. They developed sophisticated techniques for building shelters, making clothes, and surviving extreme cold. Of course, in her case, things were about to go to an all-new level of extreme. Her native land, Alaska, had been an American territory for over 3 decades, following its purchase from Russia in 1867. The purchase was initially met with skepticism by many Americans, who referred to it as Seward's folly, after then Secretary of State William Seward. However, by the end of the 19th century, Alaska's strategic value was becoming more apparent, especially with the Klondike Gold Rush of 1896 to 1899. By the time young Ada was born, the Alaskan demographic was changing rapidly due to an influx of settlers. Back then, Alaska was governed as a district with limited infrastructure and governance. The American presence in Alaska was mostly concentrated in coastal towns like Nome, Sitka, and Juneau. Life in rural Alaska remained dominated by native Alaskan groups like the Inupiat, who maintained a largely subsistence-based lifestyle. Unlike many Native American groups in the United States, the Inupiat did not face the same aggressive military conquest or displacement. Alaska was far more isolated, and large-scale settlement of the region by non-Native Americans didn't happen until after the gold rush of the late 19th century. However, this did not mean that the Inupiat were unaffected by colonization. By the late 19th century, missionaries, particularly from Protestant denominations, began to arrive in Alaska to convert the indigenous population to Christianity and assimilate them into Western ways of life. Missionaries played a significant role in the cultural and social changes the Inupiat faced during this time. They discouraged the use of native languages and traditional spiritual practices, instead promoting English and Christianity. Moreover, the Inupiat suffered from the introduction of diseases brought by European and American settlers. Smallpox, influenza, and tuberculosis took a heavy toll on native populations in Alaska during the 19th and early 20th centuries. Tuberculosis in particular was rampant among native Alaskans, including the Inupiat. Western influence was gradually altering Inupiat society. The introduction of new trade goods, weapons, and alcohol, combined with increasing interaction with American settlers, created social and economic shifts. Traditional hunting patterns began to change, especially as Westerners arrived in greater numbers. The fur trade, in particular, was a significant force in changing the local economy. Many native Alaskans, including the Inupiat, became involved in trapping furs for trade with non-natives. The turn of the 20th century also saw growing efforts by the U.S. government and missionary groups to assimilate native Alaskans into American society. Schools were established, and children were often forced or encouraged to attend, learning English and Western customs. This was a time when many indigenous children were sent to boarding schools, where their native languages and traditions were suppressed. Despite these pressures, many Inupiat continued to live in traditional ways well into the 20th century, maintaining their cultural practices and connection to the land. The remoteness of much of Alaska made it difficult for American authorities to exert as much control as they did in other parts of the United States. However, The early 1900s was still a time of great change as more settlers arrived, trade routes expanded, and government authority became more entrenched. During this period, many Inupiat also worked with Western explorers and traders as guides, hunters, or seamstresses. Ada Blackjack was born at a time of profound transition in Alaska, but her life was also marked by personal tragedies. Her father succumbed to food poisoning when she was just 8 years old. In the wake of this loss, her mother sent Ada and her younger sister Rita to a Methodist mission school in Nome, Alaska. There, they were cared for by missionaries who not only provided them with a basic education, but also imparted practical skills such as reading English and sewing. At the age of 16, Ada married Jack Blackjack, a former hunter and dog sled driver, and moved with him to the Seward Peninsula. The marriage, however, was fraught with hardship. The Blackjacks had 3 children, but only one, Bennett, survived infancy. Jack's abusive behavior and eventual abandonment of Ada left her in dire straits. After Jack deserted her and their son, Ada was left to fend for herself. She managed to obtain a divorce and embarked on a grueling 40-mile trek with Bennett back to Nome, where her mother resided. In Nome, Ada worked tirelessly, cleaning houses and sewing clothes for miners, but her meager earnings were insufficient to cover Bennett's treatment for tuberculosis. From here on, her life would take a drastic turn. Desperate times and a new opportunity. Desperate to provide better care for her ailing son, Ada temporarily placed Bennett in the Jesse Lee Home for Children, which was equipped to handle his medical needs. Determined to reunite with him, she then threw herself into earning enough money to support him. During this time, Nome Police Chief E.R. Jordan, who was aware of Ada's plight, suggested she consider an opportunity that could change her fate. Jordan mentioned that some men were recruiting natives to join an Arctic expedition across the Chukchi Sea to Wrangel Island. Though he was unsure of the expedition's exact purpose, he recognized Ada's skills in English and sewing as valuable assets for the mission, which required someone to craft fur clothing for the team. The expedition was spearheaded by Canadian explorer Alan Crawford and was financed, planned, and encouraged by Vilhjalmur Stefansson. This was part of a broader trend. By the late 19th and early 20th centuries, Arctic and Antarctic expeditions were at the height of international interest. These expeditions were driven by a mix of scientific curiosity, geopolitical competition, and the desire for fame. The Arctic, in particular, held a mystique as one of the last unexplored frontiers, a place where nations and individuals could make their mark on history by enduring extreme conditions and discovering new territories. Unlike many of his contemporaries, who viewed the Arctic as a desolate, inhospitable wilderness to be conquered, Stefansson was an outspoken advocate of the idea that the Arctic could be habitable for extended periods. He championed the notion of the friendly Arctic. He envisioned the northern polar region as a viable and inviting frontier, ripe for exploration and potential settlement. Although Wrangel Island was officially Russian territory, Stefansson harbored ambitions of claiming it for Canada or the United Kingdom, driven by a grand vision of establishing it as an air base for future trans-Arctic flights. He believed that with the right skills and knowledge, it was possible to survive and even thrive there. His theories were influenced by his earlier expeditions, during which he had lived among indigenous Arctic peoples and observed their survival strategies. This convinced him that Europeans could adapt to Arctic life, provided they learned from the methods of the local inhabitants. The Wrangel Island expedition was one of Stefansson's efforts to put these ideas into practice. The island itself, located off the coast of Siberia in the Chukchi Sea, had long been the subject of fascination for explorers. Wrangel Island had a history of brief and failed attempts at colonization and exploration. Previous expeditions had encountered extreme weather, food shortages, and harsh conditions that made survival nearly impossible. Stefansson, however, believed that a small, well-prepared group could prove that Wrangel Island, and by extension other parts of the Arctic, could support human life indefinitely. Stefansson had an even grander vision beyond Wrangel Island. He theorized that there was a hypothetical continent located further north. While this idea would later be discredited, it was good enough to encourage the expedition itself. The public and scientific community took an interest in Stefansson's theories, but there was also significant skepticism. His earlier expeditions had faced controversy, and some critics accused him of putting his personal ambitions above the safety of his crew members. The Wrangel Island expedition would only fuel this debate. As the expedition progressed, the lack of adequate preparation and support became glaringly evident, and the consequences were horrifying. The ill-fated expedition. To bring his ambitious plan to fruition, Stephenson assembled a team of 4 young men, comprising 3 Americans and 1 Canadian, who would serve as the nominal leader to lend the expedition a semblance of official standing and facilitate any territorial claims. Alan Crawford, a relatively inexperienced explorer in his early 20s, was joined by 3 other men, Lorne Knight, Milton Gall, and Fred Maurer. Their mission was to establish a base on Wrangel Island. This island is perpetually encased in ice for a significant portion of the year, and its environment is subjected to the relentless onslaught of cyclonic winds. Despite its harsh conditions, Wrangel Island is renowned for being the last known refuge of the woolly mammoth and boasts the highest concentration of polar bear dens globally. The expedition's original plan relied heavily on the skills of the Inupiat, who were expected to provide essential hunting and survival expertise critical to the success of the mission. However, despite their efforts, the expedition faced a significant setback when all the Inupiat families who had initially shown interest in joining the venture ultimately withdrew. This meant that Ada Blackjack was the only one who could help them. Seeing this, Vilhjalmur Stephenson offered her a salary of $50 per month to join his expedition. This amount was significantly higher than what she could typically earn. She was hired as a cook and seamstress for the small team of explorers. Initially reluctant to join due to the harsh conditions and her lack of survival experience, Ada accepted the job because she needed money to care for her ailing son. At the time, the men leading the expedition thought her knowledge of sewing animal skins into warm clothing and her role as the expedition's only woman would be helpful to the group's survival in the unforgiving Arctic. Ada Blackjack was understandably anxious about embarking on the expedition since she had never lived in the wilderness, lacked essential survival skills, and was particularly terrified of polar bears. She sought comfort and spiritual guidance from a shaman in Nome, Alaska, shortly before departing. However, the shaman's prophecy did little to calm her fears. He ominously predicted that the expedition would face death and danger. He warned Ada to be especially cautious of fire and knives. These warnings fed into her increasing apprehension, leading to further anxiety and fear once the expedition was underway. Despite these forebodings, Ada felt bound by her commitment. Having given her word and needing the money to care for her son, she could not back out. The shaman's warning would stay with her throughout her time on Wrangel Island, particularly as events unfolded that seemed to confirm the prediction. Her unease was compounded by the social dynamics of the trip as well. Ada felt uncomfortable traveling alone with 4 men. However, she was assured that additional Inuit would be hired once they reached Siberia. On September 9, 1921, Ada, along with the 20-year-old Canadian Alan Crawford and Americans Lorne Knight, Fred Maurer, and Milton Gall, set out on their expedition, with a kitten named Vic given to the men by the ship's crew as a companion on their voyage. There was no turning back, surviving on Wrangel Island. After arriving on Wrangel Island, the crew's initial expectations were soon challenged. A brief stop in Siberia had yielded no Inuit recruits, leaving Ada and the men to face the harsh realities of the island alone. The sight of the Union Jack being raised and the island being claimed as British territory only deepened Ada's sense of isolation and despair. As she watched the ship that had brought them depart, she broke down in tears, overwhelmed by the daunting prospect of their remote and inhospitable surroundings. Despite the mild weather initially providing some comfort, the situation deteriorated over time. Ada, struggling with intense homesickness and fear, became increasingly withdrawn. The presence of knives among the men, which reminded her of the shaman's warnings, only heightened her anxiety. Ada's perception of the men's attitudes toward her further fueled her distress. She felt that they were dissatisfied with her presence and suspected that Knight harbored intentions to harm her. This deep-seated fear and isolation marked the beginning of a harrowing chapter in her journey on Wrangel Island. During the brutal Arctic winter on Wrangel Island, the already fragile mental and emotional state of Ada Blackjack began to unravel. Faced with the overwhelming isolation, relentless cold, and her fears of the unknown, Ada's psychological toll manifested in a series of episodes that reflected both her deep despair and her tenuous grasp on hope. One difficult day, Ada found herself struggling with overwhelming emotions, but in the end, she found the strength to continue moving forward. However, her internal struggles didn't end there. On another occasion, Ada's mental state, strained by fear and desperation, collided with the influence of her cultural upbringing and beliefs. She grew increasingly fixated on the idea of foxes, common animals on Wrangel Island, which held significant spiritual importance in local folklore. Foxes, in particular, were sometimes seen as clever, mystical creatures with the ability to disguise themselves or serve as messengers between worlds. Driven by a deep desire to escape her bleak reality and a flicker of belief that some supernatural force might intervene, Ada began to follow the tracks of a fox that had wandered near their camp. She was convinced that these foxes were not merely animals but spirits in disguise, beings who could offer her protection, kindness, or even deliverance from her harsh circumstances. This act, however, was a dangerous one. Wrangel Island's brutal terrain was unforgiving, and wandering away from camp without proper resources could have led to disaster. But in that moment of mental and emotional strain, Ada was driven by an almost dreamlike belief that these foxes might lead her to something greater. She followed their tracks away from camp, her mind filled with thoughts of otherworldly salvation, though the reality was far more perilous. However, she eventually returned to camp, empty-handed and no closer to finding the spirits she sought. As Ada's psychological strain intensified, her ability to perform her duties waned. Her cooking and sewing became inconsistent, which led to a variety of harsh responses from the men. Initially, they tried to coax her back to her tasks. When this failed, they resorted to mocking her, denying her food, and even tying her to the flagpole as a punishment. At one point, their treatment escalated to threats of physical violence, including the possibility of whipping her. As the relentless winter set in, the men's morale sank, while Ada's spirits seemed to improve. The dire conditions forced the group to come together, and Ada threw herself into the work of maintaining their survival. They focused on staying warm, fed, and protecting their camp from the constant threat of polar bears. Amid these troubling times, the group clung to the hope that a relief ship would arrive to rescue them. The entire expedition had been predicated on the belief that they could hold out long enough for Stephenson's rescue vessel to arrive, bringing them back to civilization before winter's return. The expedition members watched as the days grew longer. Summer was here, and this was their only window for rescue. The harsh winter had begun to loosen its icy grip, and with the increasing daylight, their spirits lifted. They had been on the island since September 1921, surviving the first winter by sheer willpower and rationing, and the impending summer seemed to be their salvation. The men and Ada were anxiously awaiting the ship. However, as summer progressed, their optimism began to falter. The sun beat down on the island, but even the lengthening days did not bring the relief they so desperately anticipated. The Arctic landscape can be deceiving. Despite the appearance of warmth, much of the surrounding sea remained treacherous, bound by thick layers of ice that showed little sign of retreating. The currents and conditions in the Arctic are highly unpredictable, and the ice that surrounded Wrangel Island proved particularly unyielding. The men spent each day scanning the horizon for signs of the rescue ship, their anxiety mounting as the summer weeks slipped away. At times, the fog would lift just enough to allow them to peer out into the distance, straining their eyes for any indication of an approaching vessel. Every small sound, every movement of water or distant shape seemed to raise their hopes momentarily, only to dash them again when it became clear that no ship was coming. What they did not know was that the icy barrier surrounding Wrangel Island was far thicker and more extensive than anyone had anticipated. The ship that Stephenson had dispatched from Alaska was unable to break through the treacherous ice floes, and despite the crew's efforts to find a navigable path, the ship was forced to turn back, unable to reach them. As the summer wore on, the mood within the camp darkened. The relief they had so eagerly awaited was nowhere in sight, and with each passing day their situation grew direr. Supplies were dwindling, and the wildlife that they had relied upon for hunting was beginning to migrate elsewhere as the seasons shifted. The onset of another winter brought even greater challenges. Despite Stephenson's assurances of abundant game, the local wildlife, including foxes, seals, and bears, had migrated away from the island. The group began to suffer from severe malnutrition. Knight, who had fallen ill during a solo exploration in the fall and was showing symptoms of scurvy, grew weaker. In January 1923, with temperatures plunging to -50 degrees Fahrenheit, Crawford, Maurer, and Gall set out across the sea ice toward Siberia, hoping to secure their rescue. They never returned. No one knows for sure what happened to them. All we know is that they started on this desperate and fateful journey, leaving Ada Blackjack behind to care for Knight. Despite their careful preparation, the journey was fraught with danger from the start. They had to trek across the frozen sea. The ice was not only thick, but often unstable, with sections prone to cracking or breaking apart underfoot. The men had limited supplies and clothing for such a treacherous journey, and any exposure to the biting Arctic winds could quickly result in frostbite or worse. Crossing the sea ice, they would have been subject to disorienting whiteouts, unpredictable weather patterns, and the constant threat of falling through the ice. Moreover, the vast distance between Wrangel Island and Siberia also posed a significant challenge. The men faced an approximately 90-mile journey to reach the Siberian mainland, but the exact route was hard to determine amidst shifting ice flows and the featureless, snow-covered landscape. Navigation in such conditions would have been nearly impossible, and they had no guarantee that they could cover the distance before their food ran out or the elements took their toll. The trio set out with a sled and dogs, but the Arctic offered no mercy. At some point during their journey, the men encountered either shifting ice or an unexpected crack in the ice pack. In such circumstances, they could have been separated or stranded on ice floes, cut off from land, and slowly carried out to sea. If they had become trapped on a drifting ice floe, the men would have had no way to steer their course, leaving them to slowly starve or freeze in isolation. Another possibility is that they succumbed to exposure or exhaustion as they tried to traverse the sea ice. The extreme cold would have quickly drained their energy, and frostbite would have set in shortly afterward. Without proper shelter or the means to sustain themselves, the trio may have simply been overwhelmed by the conditions, falling to hypothermia before they could make any significant progress. Of course, we don't know for sure what happened to them. What is certain is that Crawford, Maurer, and Gall never reached Siberia. They were never seen or heard from again after leaving Wrangel Island. No trace of their bodies or equipment was ever found, despite later searches and expeditions. Back at the camp, Ada Blackjack and the increasingly debilitated Knight were all alone, cut off from any hope of rescue. This marked the beginning of an even more desperate phase of the ordeal, as Ada struggled to survive in the harsh Arctic conditions without any certainty that rescue would ever come. With no wilderness experience, she had to learn quickly to survive. She taught herself to set fox traps and shoot birds. She also faced the daunting task of scaring away polar bears that approached the camp. Despite her efforts to give Knight the majority of the fresh meat to help with his scurvy, his condition continued to worsen. He accused Ada of failing to adequately provide for them, even as she began to show early signs of scurvy herself. The harsh environment, dwindling resources, and interpersonal tensions created a dire situation. But things were about to get even worse. On June 23, 1923, Lorne Knight finally succumbed to his illness. Exhausted and emotionally drained, Ada found herself unable to muster the strength required to remove his body from his sleeping bag. Instead, she constructed a barricade from wooden boxes around Knight's remains to shield them from scavenging wild animals, a makeshift grave in the unforgiving Arctic wilderness. Seeking to escape the unbearable stench of decay, Ada retreated to the storage tent, now the only place where she could find any solace. Her only companion was Vic, the expedition's cat, whose presence offered a small comfort amid the crushing loneliness. Ada's hope that the other expedition members might return waned with each passing day, and the uncertainty of her future weighed heavily on her. She was also battling the thought of potentially enduring another harsh winter in isolation and the fear of never reuniting with her son, Bennett, who was battling tuberculosis in an orphanage. In the days following Knight's death, Ada took decisive action to ensure her survival. Her first significant accomplishment was the successful killing of a seal. With her ammunition dwindling, she turned her attention to gathering eggs to supplement her diet. She used available materials, wood and animal skins, to construct a boat. Unfortunately, her first boat was lost to the sea when strong winds carried it away. Undeterred, Ada built a second one. As the summer progressed, Ada's situation remained precarious. The fog that frequently enveloped the island made navigation and visibility difficult, adding to her isolation. However, on August 20th, 1923, she awoke from her slumber to what she believed was the sound of distant noise. Straining her ears, she heard it again, and her heart raced with cautious optimism. Grabbing her field glasses, she ventured outside into the chill, the fog momentarily lifting to reveal a distant ship. With a surge of hope, she raced down to the beach, wading into the icy water just as a boat from the ship reached the shore. When she first saw the ship, she hoped it would be carrying Alan Crawford, Fred Mora, and Milton Gall. Instead, it was Harold Noyce, a member of the expedition led by Vilhjalmur Stephenson, who emerged from the boat. It was then that the realization hit both of them. Ada Blackjack, the Inupiat seamstress who had faced relentless hardship and scorn, had endured to become the lone survivor of the expedition. Overwhelmed with emotion, Ada collapsed into Noyce's arms, her relief and exhaustion pouring out in tears. So how did life treat her afterward? Life after survival. The dramatic conclusion of her ordeal, coupled with the deaths of the other expedition members, created a media sensation. However, Ada sought to distance herself from the ensuing public attention. Her primary focus was on reuniting with her surviving family. She took her son Bennett to Seattle for treatment of his tuberculosis, got married once again, and eventually had another son, Billy. Following this, Ada returned to Alaska, seeking a quieter life away from the spotlight. Vilhjalmur Stephenson, the expedition's mastermind, and Harold Noyce, her rescuer, both tried to leverage her harrowing experience to further their own interests, often at her expense. Stephenson's efforts to promote his friendly Arctic narrative and the sensational aspects of the expedition led to several books and articles that chronicled her ordeal. However, Blackjack did not benefit from these commercial ventures. She received no compensation from the numerous accounts written about her experiences. Apart from her expedition salary of $50 a month, which was a substantial sum for her at the time, and a few $100s earned from trapping furs on Wrangel Island, Blackjack's financial gain was minimal. In the latter years of her life, Blackjack lived in relative obscurity. She resided in the Pioneer Home, a state retirement facility in Palmer, Alaska, where she spent her final years away from the public eye. Tragically, on May 29, 1983, she passed away in the facility at the age of 85. She was buried in Anchorage Memorial Park Cemetery, where a plaque dedicated by her son Billy marks her resting place with the title, "The Heroine of Wrangel Island." Today, years after her ordeal, Ada remains an icon of survival and resilience. Holly Mitikuk Nordlum, an Inupiat artist from Alaska, for instance, feels a strong connection to Ada Blackjack's legacy. As someone who grew up in a traditional village setting, Nordlum contemplates the depth of Ada's endurance, often questioning if she could have survived under similar circumstances. For Nordlum, Ada's remarkable strength and resourcefulness in the face of extreme adversity echo the qualities needed for survival in rural Alaska, even in modern times. She sees Ada not just as a historical figure, but as a reflection of her own community's spirit of resilience. Ada's story continues to inspire the masses, making her a figure of great significance within the Inupiat culture and beyond. Well, that's it for now. Thanks for watching. Did you like this video? If you did, please consider liking, dropping a comment, and hitting the subscribe button so that you don't miss out on our new uploads. Also, don't miss this video you see on your screen right now. It's truly unbelievable.